welcome to the podcast. I'm your host today, Michelle Dawn Mooney. From geopolitical instability and cyber threats to physical security and executive protection, the world has changed, and so has the way organizations need to think about resilience. Today, we will discuss what the shift means for businesses, leaders, and security teams trying to stay ahead of emerging risks. And today, we are joined by a leader from the Chertoff Group who is helping organizations navigate a world where security risks are evolving faster than ever before. Ben Joelson is principal and head of security risk and resilience for the Chertoff Group. Ben, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Michelle. Glad to be here.
Looking forward to getting into this conversation. It is an important one. But before we do that, would you mind giving us a brief bio?
My name is Ben Joelson. I've been at the Chertoff Group over 10 years, which is crazy to say. The first part of my career actually started in the Air Force as a U.S. Air Force Security Forces officer. That was primarily in the nuclear security space. I was a nuclear convoy commander. I was also an anti-terrorism officer. I had the tough assignment of being stationed in Italy, which was incredible. And then after that, when I left the Air Force, I joined the Chertoff Group, and I've basically been exclusively focused on the physical security, corporate security, business resilience space, and kind of guiding companies through, Fortune 500 companies through their challenges and risks in today's dynamic world. So super excited to talk to you. I also spent a brief stint as the president of a small aerospace and defense company. Where we were training Afghan pilots how to fly Black Hawk helicopters. So excited to have the conversation today and to discuss the risks that businesses are facing.
And clearly, we have the perfect guest for this conversation with that resume. So thank you for sharing, Ben. I want to start off here. The theme for today is the world has changed. So when you look at the security landscape today versus even 5 years ago, what stands out the most?
We ask ourselves that question a lot at the firm because things are changing so quickly. And if you think about when I kind of joined the Air Force after 9/11, we were very much in a global war on terror footing and mindset. We were looking to disrupt significant plots that had, what we would say a lot of digital dust, a lot of things that we could detect and information that we could surface about a potential attack. And we've moved much further into the kind of lone wolf. I hate to use that term because it's overused, but the reality is much smaller, sort of ideologically motivated adversaries that are very comfortable addressing grievances with violence. So I think one of the biggest changes that I've seen and observed over the past decade, advising different companies, is this idea that individuals are now comfortable taking violent steps to deal with what they perceive as a grievance, whether it's real or perceived, and they're thoughtful in how they're thinking about targets in terms of symbolism and who they're attacking. So I think that that change has challenged security planners because we've moved from, in some cases, large, logistically challenging type of attack scenarios, which are certainly still an issue and planners need to think about them, much more into sort of a mitigation footing where we're responding in real time to security incidents that are frankly as creative as the individuals that are carrying them out. So that's very challenging for security planners in government, in the private sector. And I think it is indicative of a shift in kind of tactics and the landscape that we've seen over the past, call it 5-10 years post the 9/11. It's now something that we're really working hard to manage.
And Ben, from a risk and resilience perspective, what would you say organizations are underestimating right now with everything that you just laid out there?
There are a couple of things that organizations either are underestimating or frankly, there's some cognitive dissonance around. I think one of them is the impact that AI is having. I know everybody is talking about AI all the time. I think organizations are underestimating just how impactful that's going to be for their workforce and how disruptive it's going to be for individuals at their companies. And so if you think about so much of our personal dignity is tied to what we do for a living. And if AI displaces a job or displaces a role or leads to a reshaping of a workforce, in our world, that could create an insider risk or a workplace violence concern. And I'm not sure that companies or CHROs or general counsel are fully thinking about how that sort of tsunami wave of changes to the job market may impact or create insider risk concerns. And so I think that's one area. I think the second that companies are potentially underestimating is just the level of converging risks that we're seeing in the world. So you have geopolitical conflicts, multiple geopolitical conflicts, hot wars that are actually occurring and impacting operations in the Middle East, Central Eastern Europe. You have the AI kind of workforce dynamics that I'm describing. And then you have a lot of the sort of political polarization that's occurring in the chatter. So you think about all of those things somewhat converging. I think some companies have been caught flat-footed historically by not anticipating the convergence of those risks.
Yeah, we're seeing organizations facing overlapping threats. You mentioned AI. So, of course, cyber, but then physical, reputational, geopolitical. How should leaders think about interconnected risk today?
The enterprise risk management space was historically very much about the risk bow tie and kind of color charts and heat mapping. And AI is actually helping with sort of speed to decision making. But I think now companies are thinking much more holistically about how they recover in the event of foreseeable incidents. So it's much more about recovery, focusing on foreseeable challenges, credible risks, credible threats, and really the scenario planning beforehand. So if you think historically, a large multinational company, they would run a business continuity impact assessment or business impact analysis. They would look at recovery time objectives. It was a very sort of spreadsheet heavy exercise. I think now you're seeing risk professionals in companies. Some companies have chief risk officers. A lot of times, chief security officers are stepping into that role for non cyber risks, and you have chief information security officers. There are a lot of scenario based planning, or there is a lot of scenario based planning underway to evaluate how companies should respond to these foreseeable concerns. So it's moving from sort of a very kind of governance driven, Excel driven process into much more of a realistic, let's get the leaders in the room around the table. Let's have a framework for how we're going to respond to incidents and security concerns, but let's not try to over engineer or over architect what the plan is going to be, because the reality is the world is changing so quickly. And as I mentioned earlier, adversaries are implementing creative attack structures and schemes that are going to challenge any traditional framework. So moving from reactive to proactive and really creating space for decision makers to be empowered to respond to challenging events and evolving risk.
With that said, what separates organizations that respond effectively during a crisis from those that struggle?
A lot of organizations that are on their toes as opposed to on their heels incorporate is a strong risk intelligence program. So if we think about going back to our government days and military days in the intelligence community, we always wanted to establish, critical information priorities, priorities of intelligence, things that battlefield commanders wanted to know in order to inform their planning and attack cycles. That's very much how businesses are thinking about intelligence now. The sort of slow academic cycle and long sort of economic cycles around quarterly reporting that we used to see impacting operations has been replaced by real-time security concerns and real-time geopolitical risks bubbling up. So companies are now actually thinking, okay, what are the priorities of intelligence that I need to understand? How do I actually build an intelligence apparatus to think about actionable and digestible risk and develop sources and methods in a way that's obviously legal and ethical, but can help inform them and illuminate potential risks around the corner that they may be walking into. So I think that's one area, leaning forward on risk intelligence. Another area, and we may talk a little bit more about this, is just thinking more holistically about executive risk management. The leaders of these companies, which historically either enjoyed a bit of anonymity, have now been, kind of thrust into the limelight and have to kind of contend with online, as I mentioned earlier, online grievance narratives that could kind of surface in negative ways and lead to an increased risk that they need to manage. So definitely prioritizing a risk intelligence capability, and then also thinking more holistically about executive risk and some of their leaders that may be at risk of increased targeting.
You touched on this briefly about preparing for the inevitable sometimes here. So are companies becoming more proactive about resilience, do you think, or are most still reacting after incidents occur?
Recommend that companies leverage other people's burning platform events. So competitors, folks in their industry, take notice. It shouldn't be if somebody gets attacked or there's a cyber incident or a geopolitical concern or reputational concern, the mindset should be, okay, how do I apply that same set of circumstances to my operations? And how do I ensure that we're not caught flat footed and that there's not a foreseeable gap? The ones that are most successful and positioned to manage the dynamic risks today are also learning from their peers and competitors in terms of the responses and challenges they're making to security incidents.
What are some blind spots that you consistently see when organizations assess their own security posture?
Some areas and blind spots that certain companies are contending with right now that we're seeing is the inability to kind of think holistically and what we would refer to as a red team manner about how some of their decisions are perceived in the market or perceived by subsets of populations on the internet, frankly. So they may be making a decision that they feel is in the best interest of the company. It doesn't seem to be outwardly controversial, but somehow some corner of the internet is offended by what they're doing, and it leads to a negative echo chamber and a spiraling effect. And companies that have not developed a robust risk intelligence capability or social media monitoring capability may have no idea that that's percolating in a negative way in some of the darker corners of the internet. So I think some blind spots for companies are simply even understanding the sentiment against the company and against specific, executives, and measuring that sentiment to determine, is it trending up, is it trending down, is there more noise, are there credible concerns, aspirational concerns. So I think, not necessarily monitoring for the types of threats and chatter that we would expect them to monitor is a blind spot for certain companies.
We tend to hear more about these conversations when it comes to large events, the Olympics, the World Cup, public gatherings. All of them seem more unpredictable than ever. So, what has changed operationally in special event security?
Special event security is a huge topic right now. It's difficult because, unlike, a corporation or a bank or a facility or a data center where you're trying to keep people out, you're obviously encouraging folks to come in. And so there's this balance and trade-off between the quality of life and the quality of the experience for the attendee, but deterring, detecting, and defeating a potential attack. So it absolutely is top of mind with FIFA World Cup kicking off, LA 2028 after that, political conventions down the road in a couple of years, and the heightened temperature that I mentioned earlier, whether it's politically or due to domestic or geopolitical events or domestic concerns. What we're seeing now is really trying to leverage technology as much as possible to push the perimeter out in terms of screening and detection. I'll give you two examples. One is, I think with AI and analytics, we're finally getting to the point where we can detect weapons, particularly drawn weapons. If you think about some of the attack scenarios that we've seen, unfortunately, over the past couple of years, if a weapon is drawn, now cameras have the ability, if they're properly tuned with analytics, to detect and alert authorities to a potential weapon draw. So AI and analytics are accelerating the speed and quality of that type of decision making. And then we're also seeing on the screening technology side, if you've been to a sporting event recently, the days of sort of old school metal detectors and being wanded in bags that we would call bags and mags, are sort of moving away, and you're moving into a more frictionless, kind of seamless experience where you're walking through, um, you know, open technology that's detecting an anomaly or a concern. So I think you're seeing planners trying to push the perimeter out. They're also trying to get rid of large, standing congregations of people outside security perimeters that just present soft targets for a potential attacker, moving people into the stadium where they have layers of security built out. And then, of course, the kind of public private partnership. So, working with law enforcement, working with local law enforcement and security planners and government planners to establish that public private partnership to ensure that there's, security for foreseeable events and concerns. That's top of mind for any planner these days. But it is challenging, and again, when we talk earlier about converging risks, you have a lot of decision making fatigue that can occur with certain security planners. So they're really trying to leverage technology to ensure they keep their edge, and use analytics for that speed to decision making, like I mentioned earlier.
And you talked about balance. So, I want to ask you about that. How do you balance creating a secure environment without making people feel restricted or overwhelmed?
Balancing the perception of attendees, the landscape has changed in the sense that maybe 10 years ago, folks didn't want to feel security when they went to an event. They didn't want to have an outward sort of strong security presence. They didn't want to feel like they were processing into Fort Knox to attend a concert or to attend a sports and entertainment venue. I think now folks actually have a proactive expectation that there's going to be a duty of care that's met by the venue that they're attending. So it is certainly about not impeding the quality of their experience and making them feel welcome. But I also think people are more tolerant of going through security checkpoints now in light of everything that's happening in the world. And in some ways, it gives them a sense of security that folks who are putting on these events have thoughtfully considered security concerns and have done their best to keep weapons and adversaries out of the venue so that they can have a safe and enjoyable experience. So, certainly, it's still about ensuring they can enjoy themselves and thinking much more about response and recovery and leveraging technology to be as unobtrusive as possible. But I do think there's been a sort of recalibration around seeing and feeling visible security actually as being more of a comfort and kind of peace of mind for attendees.
I want to talk about the leadership angle. During periods of uncertainty, what do leaders need to communicate internally to maintain trust and confidence?
Security leaders, we often and there's two ways to think about it. One is sort of security leaders, so folks that are managing security at large companies or venues, and then the other are the sort of leaders of the company. And there's a separate but complementary element to answer that question as it relates to those two groups of stakeholders. In terms of security leaders, one of the areas that we often struggle with, and I say this as an Air Force Security Forces officer, we tend to think in terms of shift work and in terms of mission and achieving the mission. And when we're on duty, we're on duty and we're focused. When we're off duty, we're not as focused, and we pass on the baton to the next person who steps up and salutes smartly and does their job. We need to do a better job of thinking strategically and running, particularly in the private sector, running security teams like business units. So thinking about how are we telling our story connected to the overarching mission of the organization? What are our key objectives, our strategic objectives to achieve that mission? What are the key initiatives that are seconded under those objectives that we're pursuing to achieve them? And then what are our metrics and KPIs? We just tend to be very bad at that as security professionals. We're much more focused on see the threat, respond to the threat, deal with the issue. And the reality is, in light of the dynamics that we've been talking about, you're going to get your clock cleaned unless you think through the long-term kind of breathe through your nose over the horizon planning as it relates to security. On the flip side, if you're in the stakeholder group that's a company, a large multinational that's trying to ensure that duty of care is met and premise liability concerns are addressed, and frankly, their employees and their guests and customers feel safe, you have to stop ignoring security as well. I mentioned earlier a level of cognitive dissonance where we don't want to think about bad things happening. I think the most successful leaders that we've seen in this space don't have that sort of head in the sand mentality, but instead have realized that by moving on their toes and actually leaning into addressing security gaps and challenges and making it a strategic priority, they're not only making their guests, employees, folks feel safe and visitors feel safe, they're also creating the muscle memory that in the event of an incident will actually mitigate the disruptiveness of that type of a concern. So I think security is now a boardroom topic that's coming. Cybersecurity has been in vogue for a long period, for the past decade, I would say, or more. We're starting to see physical security challenges, executive protection, geopolitical risk percolate into the boardroom. And so those leaders that recognize and are clear-eyed about those risks tend to do a better job of driving that down through the organization and preparing their teams for what a foreseeable challenge could look like.
And a follow up to that, talking about that boardroom kind of vision, how important is cross functional alignment between security, communications, HR, legal, and then, of course, operations?
Hugely important. I know we often say it and it's perhaps overstated, but it cannot be overstated. The level of cross-functional communication that needs to occur to deal with dynamic risks in today's environment. So, historically, you would see bright line distinctions between cybersecurity professionals, corporate security professionals, legal professionals, and ethics, investigators, and HR. The reality is bringing those folks together in a cross-functional way, whether it's an insider risk working group or a threat working group, or to have some sort of an executive security council where they're discussing and giving oxygen to these ideas. What we can't do is kind of dig parallel trenches, tune us into a specific risk that's occurring, one trench over. So I think you're seeing these slit trenches being dug between areas of expertise so that companies are more holistically prepared to respond to foreseeable challenges, and particularly between cyber and physical. That, it was very, I said in vogue earlier, but it was very in vogue for cyber and physical to be converged under one leader. We saw that at about a third of companies, I think, at the high watermark, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. Now I think there's recognition that those skill sets are distinct, but the cross-functional working group and collaboration and where they meet on certain issues and kind of roles and responsibilities, that's where you need to already have an understanding of that framework before the incident occurs so that you can effectively respond.
And speaking of roles, what role does company culture play in resilience and crisis preparedness?
We often talk about a culture of security, and it's tough because you're trying to build. Many companies refer to themselves as a family. I tend to prefer the team analogy because on a team, some people play, some people don't play, but you're still working towards a common purpose. And I think protecting the family and thinking about a culture of security starts at the top, like I mentioned earlier. It starts with what we would say in the military is that commander's intent. So what are we putting out as the vision of the organization as it relates to safety and as it relates to security? And then it's about thoughtful engagement with your workforce. I mean, training and awareness, doing walkthroughs. I think people, it's sort of it's similar to the sports venue analogy that we were talking through earlier, or scenario that we were talking through earlier. I think employees expect now in today's dynamic environment that their company will thoughtfully consider their safety and their risks and will in turn train and empower them to respond to a security situation, and that breeds a culture of security that they can then cultivate. And it's this virtuous cycle where folks coming into the organization get kind of indoctrinated in a good way into that culture of security. The companies that we see successfully navigate security challenges are ones that have really bought into that security culture and the culture of safety. And it starts at the top, and works its way down.
I want to circle back to the tech side of things here. Where do you see the greatest opportunities and maybe the greatest risks tied to technology over the next few years?
Is a dual-edged sword in the sense if we think about AI in this sector, in the security sector, AI is not a replacement for good judgment and sound judgment and experience. And so I think there's a risk in certain sectors and certain scenarios where we overly rely on AI to outsource the critical thinking necessary to respond to a critical concern. There's a dual-edged sword element to how AI is being rolled out in the security ecosystem. On the one hand, like we mentioned earlier, it's helping with speed to decision making. It's connecting disparate data sets. It's actually moving us closer to what has often been called a single pane of glass, where you can kind of have a God's eye view over the risks that are impacting your ecosystem. On the other hand, it's no substitute for sound judgment. It's non-deterministic. There are going to be creative attacks that occur and creative plots that are, as I mentioned earlier, that are as creative as the adversaries that are considering them. So you're going to need a human in the loop make a judgment call in certain security situations. So I think technology is enabling the speed of decision making, but it is still, at the end of the day, even with the best AI and LLMs, it is still a decision support tool, and it has to be viewed that way by leaders in our space. You can't outsource the critical thinking and the security ecosystem. The missions are just too important. Life safety is too important. Security is too important to kind of fully outsource that into the AI ecosystem.
And throughout this conversation, you've talked about the importance of being proactive. So I want to ask you, what should organizations be preparing for now that they may not yet be talking about enough?
It's a couple of things. One, having a forward-looking analysis on your business calendar or business planning, and adopting a security mindset as you're thinking through that calendar. And what I mean by that is you may be considering a new product launch, you may be restructuring your workforce, you may have some quarterly numbers which may be good or not good. Each of those decision points or each of those information points can, cause a reaction in the security space and can cause a reaction of the threat landscape. So I would consider almost like a red team approach to your business calendar and what you have coming, and thinking proactively about circumstances which could increase your inherent risk profile and potentially lead to a heightened level of security risk for your company and your organization.
You mentioned mindset. So, what's one mindset shift every leader should make when they're thinking about security and resilience?
One mindset shift is avoiding the cognitive trap of saying that will never happen here. The cognitive dissonance. We just have a natural tendency not to think about worst case scenarios. So if we think about risk as the product of probability and severity, yes, high probability risks are concerning, but high severity risks, low probability, are also concerning and also result in overarching risks. So that's not to say the sky is falling and security, corporate leaders need to be cowering in a defensive crouch all the time. But I do think it's worth evaluating and taking a hard look in the mirror in terms of, are you ready for a foreseeable security challenge, a workplace violence incident, a supply chain disruption, a cargo theft, whatever it is in your specific industry. Ensure that risk register is reflecting the reality of the world we're living in today.
I'm going to ask you, if you could give organizations one piece of advice to better prepare for the future, what would it be?
One piece of advice that I would give is to bring together your senior most risk leaders and folks that are closest to the mission of your organization, and to challenge them to think creatively about the threats and risks that could disrupt your business.
So, last question as we're wrapping up. We talked about obviously the bad things that are happening in the world, and unfortunately, we will continue to see them happen. But the good news is that we have the ability to be proactive and to be able to assess those situations, hopefully, before they even happen. So, what gives you confidence about the future of security and resilience based on that?
So the converging risks that we talked about earlier, geopolitical, starting with the pandemic and everything in between, attacks, hot wars, things that are occurring. One of the positives is that it has created a cadre of leaders that are very resilient in how they approach risk and have mental dexterity to consider security challenges and kind of think a little bit around corners in terms of where the hockey puck is going. We've seen our industry move from particularly in the physical security space, being, kind of square badges, polyester uniforms, front desk check-in type roles, into much more of a high-end right, intelligence-driven operation where we're leveraging, many folks coming out of government that have cutting-edge skill sets in intelligence and security operations are now applying those skills to the private sector. And really, like they've been forged in the fire of take your pick of whatever crisis they've dealt with when they were in government or even in industry. I think you're just seeing the next generation of security leader that's tech enabled. They're thinking proactively about the risks and concerns that affect their business, and they understand that there are converging risks. So they're identifying those cross-functional stakeholders to reach out to now before something materializes. So that gives me hope that our industry is changing and we're adapting faster than we ever had to because we need to.
And I want to thank you, Ben, for your time today. An important conversation, a conversation that we need to have, and more conversations like this. We basically just scratched the surface here, but if you go to the chertoffgroup.com, you can find out more information about what Ben was talking about and a variety of resources there. So, Ben, thank you for being here and sharing your insight and your wisdom to help other leaders be proactive when it comes to security and safety and resilience.
Thanks, Michelle.
And I want to thank all of you for tuning in and listening to the podcast. If you would like to learn more about what we've discussed here today, you can visit the chertoffgroup.com. I'm your host, Michelle Dawn Mooney. Thanks again for joining us. We hope to connect with you on another podcast soon.